There are going to be some unique needs from the national security perspective for sustained maneuver that drive things, but there will be lots of mutual benefit, and that will lead to economic opportunity.
Hello, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Aerospace Corporation. Today, we have not one, but two retired generals. Our own Marty Whelan, who is retired Major General from the Air Force, and Senior Vice President of Aerospace Corporation's Defense Systems Group. He's talking to John Shaw, former Lieutenant General of the U.S. Space Force and former Deputy Commander of U.S. Space Command. There, he was responsible for delivering space combat power to our unified, joint and combined forces for national and allied defense. And they'll be talking about sustained maneuver as a new way of operating in space that has consequences for how we design and build satellites and the way of warfare in general. This is a follow-on of sorts to our 6-part series on ISAM, or In-Space Servicing, Assembly, and Manufacturing, as well as our series on contested space. So if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out those. All right, let's get started. Over to Marty.
Thank you, Colleen. I appreciate the introduction. And we're here today with Lieutenant General John Shaw. John is a good friend of mine. We met many years ago out in a parking lot at Falcon Air Force Base, of all places. And so his career has seen a lot of change in the Air Force, change in establishment of the Space Force, change in the threat, change in technology. And so this is an opportunity for us to talk with General Shaw and get his thoughts on where we are and where we're going. So General Shaw, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Marty, glad to be here. Colleen, thanks for that introduction. And it's been an exciting time ever since we first met for space in so many different ways. We could never cover it in the podcast today. We'll just have to do a different one later. That looks back. But happy to be here and talk about what we're doing moving forward.
All right. Well, thanks. I wanted to start with a topic that you raised probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And over the years you've been talking about, and that is dynamic space operations. What are dynamic space operations, and why did we need to sustain maneuver? And what is the concept that you're trying to get everybody to wrap their heads around? Because I know you well enough that it's not a simple concept. With you, it's always a very complex concept. So could you explain to us what you're trying to get across to the audience?
Yeah, so the whole premise is based on a realization that we came to at U.S. Space Command, in particular some things that I was working on, that we've traditionally done what I would call positional space operations. I mean, from the very beginning, from the late 1950s when we first started launching satellites, we basically would put them into constant energy orbits and we would leave them there. A lot of that was, first of all, practical because we were doing Earth-facing missions and you wanted to use the beautiful gifts that Kepler and Newton gave us to leverage orbits to do those Earth-facing missions. And a lot of it, and that's sustained today, is just we didn't have the ability to do much more than that, put them into orbits and leave them there. But it was sort of a realization that, hey, in the future, we probably aren't going to be able to do that and achieve all of our objectives for security and awareness and even operational needs in time of competition through conflict. And so the concept is, hey, we need to rethink this, right? We've been doing it wrong. And for what subset of overall, because we're not going to not everything is going to suddenly become dynamic, nor should it. Most commercial systems are probably going to stay positional. A lot of civil will stay positional. If it's basically an Earth-facing mission, it's probably staying positional. But there is an existing and growing subset of missions that I think need to embrace and leverage this theory of dynamic space operations, which means they're going to be changing their energy states much, much more frequently.
So it's an and, not an or. as you go forward, and applying the right concept and for the right reason is kind of what I hear you say.
Absolutely. I think most of those missions are what we would say is in-domain missions. You don't really care about looking down on the Earth or such. They're going to be doing things within the domain. And so how do we kind of rethink that as a mindset? And I think it's a compelling concept, because the more you end up thinking about it, and we found this as we were discussing it at U.S. Space Command and in Space Force, the more you realize it's very similar to what we do in other domains. We would not, there was a time in history when land warfare was largely positional, based on forts and fixed locations and such. But that's clearly not how you do land warfare today. And there are numerous examples of where that fails.
Because
the same in other domains.
Yeah, because the way of warfare has changed, and what was an advantage is no longer an advantage, and you're building on that type of approach. I see.
Yep. And so that's the basics of it, Marty. And then there's a lot of ways that you start to pull that apart. What does that mean in terms of what our architectures look like? How does it now maybe make us think about what our actual platform design looks like?
Yeah.
What does logistics now mean in the space domain? And I think it becomes a very compelling, captivating idea.
Yeah, I'm going to pick at that as we go through this discussion today, because I know, we don't fly airplanes the same way we did when the Wright brothers were there. We've evolved, and your concept says we can evolve here. So there's a lot of other things we can go on, but there's a pinch point here that I want to get some clarification. Is DSO just another name for ISAM, the in-space servicing and assembly and manufacturing? Is it just the same thing, just different wrapper?
So the short answer to that is absolutely not. It's not. Now, that's not to diminish ISAM. I think that's a terrific topic itself, and I think the Aerospace Space Policy Show did a terrific series there at the end of 2023, walking through different ways to think about on orbit servicing but those would be tools to enable dynamic space operations. Where they're different, let me talk about a couple myths that we sometimes run into when we talk about DSO. The first is, hey, DSO, so when you talk about sustained maneuver, you're doing that so you can refuel on orbit, so you can extend the lifetime of a platform. And that's a myth. It may not extend the lifetime of a platform whatsoever if I can refuel a satellite on orbit. In fact, it might even diminish the lifetime because I'm using it so much. But what it gets me is sustained maneuver over time. And I can start doing that from day one when a platform is on orbit. And so, the rough analogy would be, we don't do aerial refueling for our fighter aircraft today, or any aircraft, in order to preserve the lifetime of the landing gear. You do it to sustain maneuver, gain a competitive advantage, increase combat capability, and a lot of other things that are not related to extending the lifetime. So ISAM will be part of a solution set to enable dynamic space operations, but they are not the same thing at all.
All right. Thanks for the clarification. In your earlier answer, you talked about the DSO and how it could be helpful in domain, in space. But wouldn't space dynamic space operations play out not just in space, but in support of ground defense, ground operations? Is it both? How does it help the joint warfighter?
Yeah, it's simply a component of the multi-domain fight. And the more that we can present dilemmas to an adversary in the space domain, a potential adversary in the space domain, and make things more complicated there, we contribute to a broader dilemma for an adversary and its calculus. And so it's the same. We could go through analogy over analogy about how maneuver in the air, maritime, and land domains together enable the joint force to present dilemmas to an adversary, to achieve operational surprise, to maintain initiative. We would simply apply those same principles in the space domain. I also think it would contribute to integrated deterrence. If we're predictable in what we do in the space domain, we can continue to conduct positional space operations in a very predictable fashion. That gives an adversary confidence. They know where we're going to be tomorrow. It allows them to target. It's what actually enables first mover advantage in what we talk about today, is because we conduct positional space operations. The more we transition to dynamic space operations, the more we kind of upset that calculus. First mover advantage becomes less of a thing, and we become less predictable, and that makes an adversary less confident, and that contributes to deterrence.
So you make a good argument for why we need to transition to dynamic space operations and how it helps us with deterrence and all that. But let me look at through the lens backwards. What if habitually we talk about change and our bureaucracy doesn't change as fast as we would like to change? You can agree with that or not, but I think that we're not as dynamic in our decision making as we probably need to be. What if our adversary beats us to this point? What if the adversary goes, that John Shaw, he's brilliant. He's got a great idea. We need to become dynamic in our space operations. What kind of problem would that present to us?
Well, you don't want to be second, for sure. And frankly, I think China is doing a number of things today that are advancing their capability to do dynamic space operations for some of their platforms. They're looking hard at refueling. They actually fly their satellites in much more aggressive ways than we do, the particular ones that are doing what I call in-domain missions, right? They're not supporting an Earth-facing mission. They're actually doing space domain awareness or other activities within the domain. And Marty, there's countless examples of, if you don't shift your paradigm of operations quickly enough, you find yourself behind an adversary, and that is not good when you finally get into conflict. I mean, the example that's coming to mind right now is early World War II. The Western Allies were still largely in a positional land operations mindset. You had the Maginot Line. You had a lot of lessons that were quote unquote learned from World War I about how you prepare for positional operations. But their adversary had learned how to do dynamic maneuver operations, blitzkrieg, in ways that changed the paradigm of warfare that you never would have thought. The force structure in 1940 between the Western Allies and Germany that would have given Germany such an advantage, but it was the way that they applied that that made a huge difference and was the difference between victory and defeat in 1940. We wouldn't want that same thing to happen in the space domain. And by the way, the responsibility extends beyond the space domain. If we lose the fight in the space domain, it has immediate and maybe permanent repercussions for the joint fight in the terrestrial domains. And so the responsibility to stay ahead of a potential adversary in this regard is very high.
Right. So your historical context is helpful. And, we went through some really rough times in World War II until the Allies changed the way of warfare. And I don't think we want to necessarily learn those lessons again. Do you see, in your time when you were at U.S. Space Command, do you see the services starting to be, I'm going to use the term enlightened, or thinking this way for dynamic space operations so that they don't get into that predicament?
No, I think it's well, first of all, I don't want to be too generalist. Well, if you look back at the interwar period, between World War I and World War II, there were a lot of theorists talking about how is warfare changing. There was discussion about how to use armor in future warfare. There was a discussion about how do you make carrier strike in the maritime domain more effective, and we ended up doing that through at-sea replenishment, which is a form of dynamic maritime operations that really increase sortie rate and unpredictability and ability to seize the initiative. I mean, the analogies just run rampant through the other domains of why we need to look at this for how we do it in the space domain. But it was still a cultural change that really kind of took some defeats or observations of defeats on the battlefield to really kind of change how we did things. So I think the same thing's happening today. I think we're having those discussions. I think many see the merits in having to change the way we do operations for some of our existing and oncoming capabilities in space. As usual, it's constrained by budgets and a little bit of bureaucracy, like you said, the usual things that kind of slow you down until you learn a lesson, and hopefully not too late. Yeah. And so I think there is a good, healthy discussion going on. It's just, I think there is a lot of factors at play, and a lot of them work against change because we're comfortable with where we are.
Right. And that's why I asked that question about, what's the advantage to the adversary? Because we have to look at their thinking, knowledgeable, smart adversary, and we have to understand that they're going to change, and so we need to be changing ahead of the threat. So I really appreciate the analogies, because I think we will repeat history. We want to repeat it on the good side. So looking back and looking at the lessons learned and observing some of the shortfalls and learning from them quickly would be important. So thank you.
Yeah, well, one recurring dynamic throughout military history that usually never works out well is to underestimate an adversary. And so that's where we should start. Is let's not assume that they're just going to keep doing the same things that they've seen us doing. That usually doesn't lead to good results, right?
We've been talking about the military application, but I want to because the power comes in so many different ways. I want to talk about how dynamic space operations could be helpful towards all the work being done on lunar and cislunar and development, and how the military, the defense part of this, works with the greater ecosystem, and how that might enhance not just our defense and our deterrence, but also our ability to expand our economy. Have you talked about, I'm done thinking at U.S. Space Command when you were there, about the impacts across all elements of power?
Absolutely. So let me first start with a little bit of reality check. Like I said at the beginning, it's it's unlikely that commercial or civil capabilities are going to want to have sustained maneuver as aggressively as we would want in the national security arena. And the rough analogy I would look to there is you don't see commercial airliners today doing aerial refueling. They kind of just don't need to. They're set up logistically and such where that isn't an added complexity that's necessary for commercial airliners. It is necessary in order to conduct military operations in the air that extend range, extend everything, combat capability, pose dilemmas for an adversary, give you global range and strike capabilities. So I want to just make sure that this is kind of special in many ways. This need for sustained maneuver is for national security capabilities in much the same way we would do things differently in the other domains from analogous commercial or even civil activities. Now, that only goes so far. At some point, there is some mutual benefit, I think, to how we, as we pursue dynamic space operations, sustained maneuver for the U.S. Space Force and U.S. Space Command and the national security arena, that has benefit also for the other sectors. And mostly, I think that we will not be able to achieve what we want to do with dynamic space operations without some change to the logistical infrastructure, both on orbit and in the development side. One of the solutions, so just to explain what I mean, one of the possible solutions to our dilemma of needing to have sustained maneuver, I pointed out, doesn't necessarily have to be refueling platforms. It can just be commoditization, where I get a new spacecraft every 2 weeks. And so I'm not constrained by lifetime or fuel. I can use it at a much higher tempo rate that approximates, sustained maneuver for that particular mission set. That could have a development effect for other capabilities on how do we more quickly produce space capabilities and platforms. From an on-orbit logistical perspective, yeah, I do believe that in the future there will be a logistical layer that enables DSO That could be refueling. It could be replenishment of consumables if it's not fuel, anything that we use. And I think that all sectors could benefit from the advancements made in that regard. And again, if we look for historical analogy there, maybe the best one is to look at the age of steam when it came on globally, and the need for coaling stations and logistical footprints around the world to enable great large fleets to be able to extend their range and their presence. Commercial and merchant activity absolutely benefited from that infrastructure that got put in place that was driven primarily for national security needs. And we could run with that analogy. I think we would see something like that evolve as well.
Yeah, building on that enhances both your economic power and there was, in your analogy with coal, that required some diplomatic passes of information and sharing. And you could see the same thing in the space environment, where you would have an international consortium working together to be able to sustain operations in space. So
right, diplomatic and partnerships. Yeah, partnerships that maybe would not have happened without that particular need that led to even more enhanced cooperation.
So you mentioned about space mobility. So in the broader space logistics, earlier you explained how they're different but complementary. What do you see the future of space logistics in the next 10 to 25 years, both from the Department of Defense or the defense industry writ large and commercially?
So I do think we're going to see refueling on orbit is going to become a norm. And I think there will be an evolution to a common standard for how we do that. By the way, a refueling infrastructure on orbit can take on multiple manifestations, right? You can have what we would call a depot that a satellite goes to get fuel. You could have something that's more analogous to a tanker or an oiler that actually goes to the platform to refuel it. And then there's something in between that can do both. And so when we think about that, it's going to be an infrastructure of multiple ways of doing that, as well as standards that need to evolve that, again, go back to this idea of partnership and cooperation beyond just our nation. So I think we'll see that happen. I also don't think, again, I have to stress, it's not limited to refueling. It could be replenishment of many kinds of consumables on orbit, and that could be in multiple sectors. If by chance you've got an asteroid mining operation in the future, and you've got a platform that's doing the mining, it's probably getting some wear and tear on that platform that you don't want to have to just completely change it out. You may just need to change out some components. That'll be part of a logistical solution. And if that future happens, I bet we'll be able to point to that logistical solution as having some national security origins to it. Yes, we learned how to do this because the Space Force or U.S. Space Command or the Department of Defense pioneered some ways of doing this on orbit.
Yes, similarly to going back to our historical analogies, we originally, as the United States settled the West, we built forts for defense and protection of the American people that then became trade centers, that then became major cities. I mean, so the dream is endless.
Yeah, and I guess I probably didn't stress it enough in my answer before, and that there are going to be some unique needs from the national security perspective for sustained maneuver that drive things, but there will be lots of mutual benefit, and that will lead to economic opportunity.
So we talked a lot about the opportunity and the inflection point, and you kind of hit on it when you talked about asteroid mining and needing to potentially change out components. It makes me think that maybe the way we build things has to change as well. And my example is, we're not flying airplanes made out of sticks and rags, flying straight and level anymore. We're actually using material science and flying airplanes way differently than we did. Heck, we're flying airplanes without a person in them anymore. So how do you see us changing for the future, how we build our space infrastructure, how we build satellites, how we think about the ecosystem and all the things that it can open up if we build them differently than a box with floppy wings.
Yeah. So there are so many opportunities here. It really, once you start thinking about it, actually gets exciting, and you realize how many assumptions you have to throw away on how you would design a spacecraft or a spaceborne platform. So, again, I'll go to analogies. I love it. In a sense, what we've done with our satellite platforms today in doing positional space operations, and with very, very few exceptions, one being the International Space Station, we'll put that aside because that does get serviced regularly, right? Our other platforms don't. So what we've really done is, if you want to, we could take your Western expansion analogy. We have built prefab forts, all self-contained, right? And we put them out there on the frontier, and we don't really go touch them ever again. They're just prefab. They're built that way to be self-sustaining. And again, from a technological perspective, in the early parts of our space history, that was the way you had to do it, and it made a lot of sense. But to realize that's what we are doing, things could change dramatically. For example, if I can refuel a satellite on orbit, not only do I get enhanced and sustained maneuver for that platform that has to operate in completely different ways than we do today, where I have to plan out maneuvers months to even years in advance to maximize the lifetime of a satellite. Not only can I operate it differently, I can design it differently. I don't need a huge fuel tank anymore. Or maybe I still want a huge fuel tank so that I can fill it and maneuver aggressively, but I don't need to launch it with that fuel tank full. And then what other ways do we build these self-contained prefab satellites now that if they're able to leverage an on-orbit logistics infrastructure, does that change the equation in terms of not only more efficient economically to build, but more efficient operationally to? And you really start to pull that apart. You realize how many assumptions go into building satellites today that would no longer apply and would give us the opportunity to.
Well, I think you open up an opportunity where we've been flummoxed in the past. That's transition. As we transition from one type of constellation to a different constellation in the same mission set, and you can go DSP to SBIRS, you can pick your favorite transition. We know what the current state looks like. We know what the end state looks like, but the transition is rough, right? So if you use the concepts of dynamic space operations and the ability to change out components, all that, you can actually smooth out that transition. So how would you use tugs and other elements of this dynamic environment? Do you think we could use them more smartly and make those transitions from one generation of mission to another generation of mission?
I think you're absolutely right. And we had discussed this at Space Command about there is some form of transition phase, right? You can't suddenly stop all of your programs in development and go back to, a preliminary design review and start all over again. I think there's going to have some adaptive transition. I think one of those could be that some of our platforms that we have not even launched yet, but have been fully designed, but we want to operate with sustained maneuver, end up getting a little outside help with a tug or a jetpack or something along those lines. Again, I think this is a far more sophisticated way of thinking about how we want to do business. I would also point out again, it's not different than the other domains.
Yeah,
we could probably look to a number of examples where platforms on the land or maritime or even in the air domain had to kind of be retrofitted with certain things that you never would have built into the design of them in the first place, but made them more capable platforms.
Right.
We would clearly be wanting to do that kind of thing as much as we possibly could to maximize the operational utility and combat capability of our platform.
Well, I appreciate your expanding on that point, because I think transition is going to be key. The point solution is easy to see. Getting to that point solution may be a little bit harder. So But thinking of transition, you've been going through one. What's in the future for John Shaw? I hear that you might even be dabbling with writing a book. What is your transition been like, going from many years serving this nation to getting a chance to be there with your family?
Well, I appreciate Marty. I was so honored to serve for 33 years in our Air Force and then our Space Force. I felt like I got really lucky to be able to finish out my career as a Space Force officer. But as I'm moving into the next phase here, there's some exciting things going on in the space sectors across them all, the commercial and the civil and the national security. And what a great time to sort of be able to sit back, look at those and say, hey, where can I help? Where can I help us think about it a little bit differently? And just to sort of see it. And that's how I'm looking at it. What I do have I do expect to continue to write as I did when I was on active duty. And so your intel's good there. I've got a couple ideas on where I think I might go with that, but I'm really excited about the opportunities. And I'm sure, my retirement ceremony that we had, I didn't call it a retirement ceremony. I called it a commencement ceremony.
Yes.
For that exact reason. Retirement sounded too final. There's still a lot of work to do, a lot of thinking to do, and I look forward to being part of that.
Well, I really appreciated the time you spent with us. Like always, when I have conversations with you, I learn, and I hope our audience has learned as well. And I appreciate your 33 years of service, like I said, but your continued service to all of the space community, because you've been a fabulous leader, somebody who pokes at things that sometimes others avoid, but it always makes us better. So really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today.
Well, thanks, Marty. Enjoyed the conversation, and thanks to the Space Policy Show and Aerospace for continuing to provide a platform for these kinds of thoughts and ideas.
Well, don't be a stranger. You're always welcome back to the Space Policy Show.
All right.
All right. Thank you much. And Colleen, back to you.
Well, thanks to General Shaw for joining the Space Policy Show. Marty led a fascinating discussion about why DSO will be an important capability in the future of defense space operations. And thank you to our audience for watching or listening. To find more of our shows, you can browse up YouTube playlists or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find more of the Center's in-depth research by topic area at csps.aerospace.org. A big thank you to James Liggins, our technical director. Until next time, everyone, thanks.